Hi all, hope things are going well. This morning I wanted to talk to you about baseline data. There's a whole chapter in the first book, Effective Differentiation, that talks about baseline data and its relevance in making provision for children with learning difficulties and SEND. And it seems to me really relevant at the moment. We're welcoming children back into schools, some of whom will have had a real hiatus, a real break in their full engagement with learning. And it may be that their skills were developing at a different rate, or that they were struggling to acquire literacy and language skills and numeracy at a similar rate as their peers already. It may be that lockdown has had an even greater impact on that, or opened up a gap that wasn't there before. And so my thoughts about that are kind of twofold and really slightly different in terms of primary and secondary education. But they're both really about being aware of and making sure that you understand the baselines that are in place in your school. In primary schools, I think it's more likely when you've got fewer teachers leading learning with a group, and they're likely to possibly have an overview of the kind of assessment information that is in place, and are likely to be using it and referring to it frequently. I think in secondary environments, sometimes there's a bit of a disconnect in terms of the collection of baseline data about literacy, language, numeracy. The other thing is that sometimes there's assumed knowledge that everybody knows and understands what is being measured and what's represented by the various scores that may be being kept on your school system. I think it's also helpful to point out that we use, one word like reading, like a reading test or a reading score, and it covers a whole multitude of things. It might be a reading comprehension test, which actually identifies whether a child can not only read a word but understand what it means and see it and use it in context. Whereas a sight reading test will see whether a child can read a word when it's out of context, but it doesn't actually tell you whether they understand that word. So it's quite important that we are really clear about which tests do what. And actually one of the easiest ways to do that is give staff copies of the tests so that they have an opportunity to understand what they're measuring. While I'm on the subject, I think it's really important to remember too that baselines aren't just about identifying areas of deficit, gaps in learning. They're also about identifying patterns and also recognising that poor literacy and numeracy can coexist quite happily with higher than average scores in non-verbal reasoning, for example. And very often children with spiky profiles, children who have specific learning difficulties of a dyslexic type especially, very often present with scores that are really quite different. So that they're not only about identifying deficits, they're also about identifying areas of strength and opportunities as well. Okay, the last thing that I'm going to mention is making sure when you are putting scores on a spreadsheet to share with a staff group that we're clear about what kinds of scores are being recorded, because obviously there are different kinds of scores. Standardised tests have raw scores, they have standardised scores, they have percentile rankings. So just making sure that there's an easily accessible legend or explanation of the kind of score that's being recorded and what that actually means, and also give people an opportunity to come back to you and to talk about that and ask questions. In the link below you'll find three things. One is a link to the book itself, Effective Differentiation. Chapter 2 is the one about baselines. There are also 2 tools that are taken from that chapter that will help teachers reflect and get to grips with the baselines you take at school. And the last thing is a number of the suppliers that provide baselining tests that you might be using. There might be some new ideas there for you too. Okay, take care, have a good week.